So today we have this 2014 Chevy Silverado with a 5.3 V8, and it's here because it has a history of a oil pressure fault code being set in the PCM. Let's have a look at the scanned information. So back in November 21st of this year, I scanned it for code because the MIL was on, and it had this P06DD engine oil pressure control solenoid valve stuck off. So it's a mechanical issue with the pressure regulation of the oil pressure in the inside the engine. It came back, of course. So here you can see that it came back again December the 12th. I brought it in to change the passenger side power seat switch. I have a video on that on the channel. And notice the MIL was back on. Back in November I couldn't find anything wrong. The solenoid seemed to be responding, but this P06DD code has returned. Now, after doing some research and talking with technicians at the dealership, they said the common problem is a problem with the oil pump or the solenoid, which are serviced as an assembly anyways. So we're going to go ahead today and change the oil pump on this beautiful truck. I understand it's a fairly extensive job, so I'll take short little video clips along the way. I couldn't find any videos on YouTube showing the process here, so hopefully there'll be one after we get done this truck. So set the vehicle up on a hoist because we're going to have to raise it, but before doing so, disconnect the air induction system. There are two ventilation pipes with release clips. Push the clips down, pull the pipes back, pivot them out of the way, and two screw clamps that hold this air induction system on. Now the serpentine belt has to come off, the whole front of the engine has to come apart because the timing cover has to come off. I see we got a stretch belt on the AC, so we'll have to deal with that. Get to use my stretch belt tool for the first time, I think. I don't know if the AC compressor has to be moved. I don't think so, but definitely all the front of the engine has to come off. So we're going to disconnect the battery because it's just a wise thing to do with all this intrusive repairs. So next step is to remove the alternator. Two bolts, different lengths by the way, pretty obvious. The cable and the electrical plug, put the alternator aside. And we're going to remove this brace and leave it attached to the power or the AC line, and drain the cooling system now. So this is the first time I'm actually using this Blue Point stretch belt removal tool. If you're interested, that's the part number. We'll see how good it works. I got it on the pulley. We're going to turn the harmonic balancer with a ratchet and a socket in the clockwise direction, and that's supposed to guide the belt off the pulley. We'll see. Well, that didn't exactly go as planned. I had to use a prying tool to give it a little help. I used a it's stuck in there now. Oh well. So remove the plastic underpan to expose the front of the engine a little better, and we're going to find, I think we're going to drain it by, I was going to remove the lower rad hose, but the lower rad hose is actually the upper rad hose. Yeah. Well, there's no I try not to use the drain cock on the radiator because sometimes it's a problem, but where the hell is it? Well, oh, there is a third stretch belt on this thing for that vacuum pump. I didn't even spot that one. This one here, that one's pretty light, so maybe I can actually just flip it off with my fingers. Isn't that special? Eliminates tensioners, so that's a good thing, but certainly not easier to service in the field. There's two braces that go across the bottom here that have to come off. So we have to remove this power steering gear, which is electric. We have to move the front differential, engine oil pan. This cross member here has to come out. Disconnect the front axle shaft or drive shaft at the joint here. Disconnect the CV shafts at the inner tripod joints. Tie rod ends, it's going to have to go for a wheel alignment after. Wow, there's a lot of work here. Way to go, GM. To disconnect the electrical connectors from the steering gear, there's release clips on all of these, or secondary locks on all these. Slide them back. This one's got a ground wire up there. You see that little ground bolt way up there. So I'm going to focus on it right up there. Braided ground strap in here. Looks like a T20 or T25. Maybe if I disconnect the four-wheel drive actuator, there'll be more room to get at it. So I've disconnected the steering shaft, the universal joint, and you can release it, spray with some penetrating fluid, and then you can put a pinch bar up through, where the hell did I have it? Up through here, like so, and tap the coupler off. Make sure you don't turn the steering wheel from this point forward. You see I've marked it. It's keyed, so you can't really put it on wrong, but you certainly don't want to turn the steering wheel and upset the clock spring orientation. So remove the front wheels, disconnect the outer tie rod ends, unclip the wiring harness from the steering gear. Now there are 3 bolts, these 2 here and one on the right side through that hole that hold the steering gear in there. And it looks like it's going to come out by moving it towards the right side until this tie rod end comes out of that control arm, and then it should drop down and go to the left. I wonder what that steering gear costs if you have to replace it. I don't imagine it's too freaking cheap. So there's actually 4 bolts that hold that in. 2 of them have 15/16 heads on this side, and they're in rubber bushing, so they don't come out with an impact gun because the bushing just absorbs the torque. And I just put this jack stand underneath here because I wasn't sure how heavy this was going to be or how awkward it was going to be to remove. So I'm going to lower it down enough to get this and move it to the right enough to get this side out, and then hopefully it'll come out of here. Make sure the harness is all disconnected. There's a bunch of clips on the harness as well. Okay, I missed this connection on this side here at this torque angle sensor. I would imagine that's a torque sensor and position sensor. And then there's another ground wire. These must be shield grounds. I don't know why they have to use a T25 on it, but they did. So this connector has to come off as well. It'll rest on the tie rod ends while you're working on it at this height. So my original thought of taking it out towards the right side didn't work because this housing hits the differential, so I had to take it out towards the left side and drop the right side through the control arm first. There's some pretty big bolts hold that steering gear in. So disconnect the 6 bolts, or remove the 6 bolts to hold the inner tripod joint to the axle flange. Tie the axle shaft up to the coil spring so that it doesn't interfere with you as you're dropping the diff. Remove the front differential universal joint, mark it so that you can put it back in the same orientation. Check the U-joint while it's apart. I think we're going to remove this cross member now. Might as well. So as you're dropping the front diff, disconnect the vent hose up here. Slides off. There's 3 plastic clips that hold the harness, this harness that goes to the disconnect motor. They're likely going to break, so you're going to have to tie wrap it in place afterwards. But it's easier to get them after you drop it down about 2 inches. I'd highly recommend a jack to do this. It's not that heavy, but heavy enough that you don't want it falling, ripping the harness connections apart. So there's the front diff out of the truck. I just might as well leave it on the jack stand because there's no need to take it off. Now you can see there's a little bit more room to get at the oil pan. Just looking underneath here, I see there's a engine oil dipstick tube going into the pan. Thanks GM. So that means there's a fastener up top, and I sprayed some penetrating fluid on it already. Oil cooler is attached to the pan. Cooler lines are clipped to the side of the engine. Oh well. It was easy, anybody would do it. So unclip the wiring harness from the front, and we're ready to let it down and take the dipstick tube out because that's going to be a problem. And might as well take the harmonic balancer off and finish disassembly. I haven't drained the coolant yet because I haven't opened the cooling system. I didn't want coolant dripping on me while I was underneath the truck. So we still have that to do. So I just removed the upper and lower rad hoses and put the lower rad hose down towards the bottom of the rad to drain it into a big catch pan. Remove the little 6mm bolt that holds the dipstick back there to the head, and twist and wiggle it up and pull it out of the oil pan, and unclip the harness from the water pump assembly. Unbolt the bracket here, another bracket here, vacuum line to the brake booster there. Boy, they sure made this water pump a pain to change now. I still haven't figured out exactly what we have to do with that AC bracket, because this bracket that holds the alternator on goes behind the AC compressor down there, and it's over top of the water pump, so all of that has to come off to do a water pump. I can't imagine what it used to be quite simple. 4 bolts, didn't have to touch anything. It was easy to do a water pump. Now they've complicated it. This obviously is the water pump now. So to get the AC compressor moved out of the way, you have to remove that stud. It has a hex on the end. I think it's 6mm or 5mm. So once you remove that stud, then the compressor will slide to the right. That bracket behind it is part of the bracket that holds the alternator on. That has to come off. So there are 7 bolts that hold the water pump on. 3 on the side here on the right side, and 4 on the left side, driver's side. Couple of clips on the harness on the back of the water pump as well. Now we got some more wiring to remove. Looks like we're going to have to remove that vacuum pump down there, because the pulley is sitting over top of the timing cover, and the timing cover has to come forward, so it looks like we're going to have to unbolt the vacuum pump off the side of the block. Wow, talk about making things complex. So I was able to remove the balancer bolt with this stubby 1/2-inch impact gun, and now I got the harmonic balancer puller in there. I'll put the part number in the description if you're interested. It's a 3-jaw puller, fits many things. Seems to be working okay. It's coming off. So there are 14 8mm bolts, 13mm heads holding the pan on, 2 6mm bolts at the back, vertical, with 10mm heads, and 2 6mm bolts on the oil cooler flange, 2 valve housing bolts that go into the bottom of the oil pan, and a couple of braces. There's the cover on the right or left side, and then the one by the starter. I think you can leave the starter one in there because you can't get it out without taking the starter out. So these 2 little bolts hold the plastic covers on the left and right. Here's the left side cover. So the pan should be ready to drop down now, but it's glued to the bottom of the block, so try and get it off. So I tapped on this front ear that sticks out from the front of the block, and I tapped on the side of the pan on the left hand side, and it dropped down, so it's ready to come out. So there's the oil pan off. This is the oil pump pickup. There's a big O-ring that's got to be replaced, and this pan is sealed with RTV sealant. There's a couple of dowels. I see one dowel has stayed here in the pan, so that means the other dowel is over here, probably, no, maybe right here in the block. Let's have a look up here. I don't see a dowel on that side. A couple of O-rings back here where the oil filter housing goes off. Those are important O-rings. Yeah, these 2 O-rings here. Make sure we got new O-rings for that. Next, the timing cover. So there are 10 bolts that hold the timing cover on. The 2 bottom ones are longer. Make sure you disconnect this connector from the oil pressure regulation solenoid, and then tap at the bottom ears here. Tap right here and right here with a small mallet. And this is held on with, or glued on with silicone as well, so it's stuck on there. And there's our pesky oil pump. wonder if I have to take this keyway out of the crank. I'll have a look at the new part and I'll see. So no, you don't have to remove that keyway. There's the old pump, 4 bolts hold it on. The new pump comes with 4 new bolts. I'll put a link in the description or a picture of all the parts. That's what I'll do. I'll take a picture of the invoice with all the parts on it that I used for this job. Several gaskets, obviously the oil pump. There's the timing chain and gears. Yeah, we're going to clean everything up and put it back together now. As you can see, you don't need to take that keyway off the crank. So we're back working on this Chevy oil pump problem. I let it sit in the shop on the hoist all night so that it's hopefully stopped dripping. Cleaned all the gasket surfaces on the engine block and the oil pan surface, and we're ready to reinstall the new oil pump. There's no gasket behind that oil pump on this side here. It's strictly a close tolerance. I'm going to make sure that surface is clean and put some oil in the new pump to pre-lubricate it. So here's the new pump. So I pre-lubricated it by pouring some synthetic gear oil into this port, which is the outlet port of the pump, and turning the pump several revolutions so that everything is lubricated in there. You could use motor oil, I suppose, but I use the synthetic gear oil because I don't think it'll leak out as fast. So use a small screwdriver to line up the pump drive wheel gear to the actual crankshaft nose, or actually crank gear. And these bolts are 18 foot-pounds. The service literature says push upwards on the pump as you're tightening the bolts up. There's little nylon spacers in each one of these bolt holes, but there is a little bit of play on them still just the same, but the service literature says push upwards on the pump. And again, 18 foot-pounds. So it's highly recommended to replace the timing cover seal because you have it off. So I've got a new seal in there. I used thread sealant around the outside of the seal. I still have to put some grease on it. Now be careful because this seal looks like it would go in this way, but in reality it goes in this way. There's no garter spring on this seal. It's got a lip, and the lip faces in, so that's important. At least there's no garter spring, so you don't have to worry about it popping off. But it goes in this way, not this way, as you can see. So the bolts on the front cover are 18 foot-pounds. Start over here, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You know, starting at the center and working toward the ends. 18 foot-pounds. A bead of RTV sealant on the cover is easier than putting it on the block. Just be careful not to touch anything on the way in. Smudge it, make sure the surfaces are spotlessly clean. Wipe them off with a clean rag and brake cleans. So don't forget to plug in the oil pressure solenoid. And there's a tie clip that clips it to the back of the oil pump up there. You can reuse the clip, but cut the tie wrap and then put a new tie wrap in there to hold it. I don't know how critical it was. I don't even think it was attached when I took it off because I don't remember unclipping it. Install the vacuum pump with a new gasket. Clean the gasket surface off. Make sure the little spacers are in each one of the bolts. These little spacers here, these little nylon or rubber spacers that guide the bolts in. And we're ready to put the oil pan up now. So I removed the windage tray so I could wash the inside of the pan with the pressure washer. I've cleaned the gasket surfaces up, as you can see. Wiped them down with brake cleans. New seal over here with dielectric grease on it. 2 new seals here going to the oil filter housing. Make sure there's dielectric grease on those. Now we're going to clean up the block and get ready to install the oil pan. So there's a bead of sealant, about 1/8 of an inch bead all the way around the outside perimeter, staying inside the bolts. Like I said, if you leave this sitting overnight, it'll drip less. I got to wipe this surface off here because there's a drop of oil here. Mind you, the O-ring is there, so it's not so bad. So we're ready to put the pan on. So there's the oil pan reinstalled. This cover back on, the one on the starter back on, the bracket holding the cooler lines back on, 2 rear bell housing bolts in. Now we're ready to put the oil cooler adapter on. Make sure you get the gasket in correctly. I see it could go in both ways, but obviously it's offset accordingly. And yeah, that's it. We just keep going. So here's the procedure for tightening that balancer bolt. New crankshaft bolt, which I have. Tighten it to 89 foot-pounds, loosen it off 360 degrees, tighten to 59 foot-pounds, and then 200 degrees. Well, 200 degrees is just over half a turn. Is half a turn to be 180. So they have a holding fixture for holding the crankshaft sprocket, or the crankshaft flywheel teeth right there. I'll show you what I did. You can put a 15/16 wrench on the ear on one of the torque converter lugs through the hole in the bell housing here, and that'll hold it. This is cut off because I was using it for something else. It doesn't have to be cut off. It's just, it's a little snug in there. I tapped it in with a hammer, and then I marked, after I had initially tightened it to 59 foot-pounds, I marked it at 0, and then I turned it 180 plus about a quarter of an inch. That's close enough to 200 degrees, and man, is it tight. So I got the water pump back on, water pump housing. Water pump is serviced separate from that housing. Now the challenge is to get this AC compressor back up there, and it's got one of those sliding bushings at the back end of it. So I'm going to put a socket on it, like you can see here, to pull that bushing back this way slightly so that I don't have trouble getting the AC compressor back up. You only have to move it about 1 millimeter just to give you some slack. So there's the AC compressor back on. Actually, the belt wasn't that hard to put on. Just start it on this side, put it on the main pulley, and turn it clockwise while you work it onto the pulley. Yeah, I had to turn a couple turns to get it into the grooves. Man, those things stretch a lot. But both stretch belts are on. Now we're going to put the front differential in. So the steering gear is back in, the front differential is back in. Let's see, the front axle shaft bolts, put Loctite on them, 58 foot-pounds. The steering gear, the 2 large bolts here are 162 foot-pounds and 74 foot-pounds for these 2. The outer tie rod ends, 26 foot-pounds and 90 degrees of torque. What's left? Wiring harness is hooked up. Well, I got to put that steering gear shaft coupler back together again. Should have cleaned the rust off that while I had the steering gear out. So it's mainly back together again. Alternator's back on, battery's hooked up, coolant's full or filled, engine oil's full. I have to check it after I run it, but I'm going to prime it. And to do that, I've removed the fuel or the starter relay. Starter relay is number 68 in the fuse panel here, this one right here. And I've got a starter relay switch in here, so when I rock the switch on, the engine will crank. So I'm just going to crank it for a few seconds to prime the oil system. Give the starter a chance to cool off. Do that a couple times, and then we'll hook up the air induction system and fire it up. So it's up and running, and the oil pressure is like 280 on the gauge on the dash, and that's in kPa. Let's see what we're at. 275. Let's have a look at the commanded state of that solenoid right now. So right now the solenoid is on, and we're running at about 38 pounds of oil pressure, 38 psi. That's not absolute oil pressure, that's gauge pressure. Absolute would be another 14 and a half, 15 pounds. There's absolute pressure right there, 53. If I turn off the solenoid, it jumps up to 55. Now I believe when I was doing that before, it only went like 4 pounds. Now it's going from 40, it's going like 10 pounds. 40 to 54, so 14 pounds of difference, and that's at an idle. I'm going to save this list, but it seems like it's working fine now. We'll button everything up, put the shields back on underneath, tires back on, take it for a road test, call it a day.